The night I handed my son the keys to everything I had built, I already knew he'd been lying to me for 3 years. I just didn't know how far the lie had gone. I'm standing on the back deck of my house in Kelowna, British Columbia. It's a cool September evening, the kind where the lake goes perfectly still and the hills across the water turn dark purple before they disappear into the sky. I built this house with my own hands. Well, not literally. I'm an architect, not a carpenter. But every corner of it carries a decision I made. The angle of the roofline, the width of those cedar beams, the way the deck wraps around the south side so you catch the last light until nearly 9 o'clock in the summer. I've been standing here for 40 years. I raised my children in this house. I brought my wife home from the hospital here after her surgery. I watched my daughter get dressed for prom on that front step. And tonight, at my retirement dinner, with 63 of my closest colleagues, clients, and family members gathered inside around tables my wife had decorated with autumn leaves and white candles, I watched my son slide a document in front of me that was not the document I had agreed to sign. My name is Norman Ashby. I'm 67 years old. I spent 32 years as a partner at Ashby Architectural Group, a firm I founded in 1994 with my best friend, a man named Crane who died of a heart attack in 2011 and left his shares to his widow, who later sold them to me at a price that was more than fair and came with a handshake and a bottle of Okanagan wine. We designed hospitals, university buildings, a community center in Kamloops that won a Governor General's award. We were not famous. We were good. There was a difference, and I prefer the second one. I had planned my retirement carefully. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is to me, whatever he became in those last 3 years, had been working at the firm for 6 years. He had talent, real talent. Not the kind you tell someone they have so they feel good, but the kind that shows up in the way a person solves a problem they've never seen before. I had watched him grow into a genuine architect, and I had been proud of him in the quiet way that fathers are proud when they don't want to make it strange. The plan was simple. I would transfer 51% of the firm's shares to him over 3 years, retaining 49% as a silent partner, drawing a modest dividend, enough to supplement my pension and keep me connected to the work without being in anyone's way. The remaining shares, held by 2 junior partners, Sylvia and Bart, would stay exactly as they were. I had a lawyer. My son had a lawyer. We had spent 4 months negotiating the terms. I had read every page of the final agreement 3 times. What I had not read, what I did not know existed, was the version my son slid across the table to me that evening at my own retirement dinner, in front of 63 witnesses who were busy laughing and refilling their wine glasses and had no idea what was happening 6 feet away from them. I'm a detail person. 32 years of reading architectural drawings at 1 to 50 scale will do that to you. I noticed it in the second paragraph of page 1. The share transfer amount had changed from 51% to 88%. A single number, the kind of change that looks like a typo, until you understand what it means. 88% would give my son not a controlling interest in the firm, but an overwhelming one. It would reduce Sylvia and Bart's shares proportionally. It would leave me with next to nothing. I looked up at him. He was smiling at the couple at the next table. He had a glass of BC Pinot Noir in his hand, and he looked completely relaxed. And in that moment, I understood something that I had been refusing to understand for a long time. He had done this on purpose. He had planned it. He had counted on the noise of the room, the wine, the occasion, the fact that I would feel foolish stopping a celebration to examine a legal document. He had counted on me being too proud to make a scene at my own retirement dinner. He had almost been right. I set the pen down on the tablecloth. "I need to use the restroom," I said. Nobody heard me. My son glanced over and I smiled at him. I picked up the document, folded it in half without explanation, put it in the inside pocket of my blazer, stood up, and walked through the restaurant toward the back hallway. I didn't go to the restroom. I went outside through the service door, stood in the alley behind the building, called my lawyer, and got her voicemail. Then I called my accountant, Philip, who had been at the firm longer than my son had been alive, and he answered on the second ring because that's the kind of man Philip is. Tell me the original transfer percentage, I said. 51, he said. Why? The document in front of me tonight says 88. There was a pause. Don't sign anything, Philip said. I didn't. Where are you? Standing in an alley behind a steakhouse in downtown Kelowna. Stay there. I'm going to call you back in 10 minutes. I stood in that alley for 22 minutes. It was cold. I didn't have my coat. At some point, one of the kitchen staff came outside for a smoke break and looked at me with polite confusion, and I nodded at him the way you nod at someone when you're having the worst night of your life, and you're trying to hold yourself together with pure force of will. Philip called back. What he told me in the next 4 minutes rearranged everything I thought I knew about the previous 3 years. My son had been in contact with a development company based in Calgary called Meridian Capital Group. They were not architects. They were investors who bought architecture firms, stripped out the talent, rebranded them, and sold municipal contracts to subsidiary companies they controlled. It was legal in the way that a lot of unpleasant things are legal. Not quite fraud, not quite honest. Meridian needed a controlling share of Ashby Crane to proceed, more than 80%. My son had promised them that. And there was more. Philip had been suspicious for about 8 months. He had kept notes, copies of emails my son had sent from a personal account he didn't know Philip could see because Philip had set up the firm's IT infrastructure in 2003 and knew every thread of it. My son had been telling Meridian that the firm was ready to transition. He had been describing my retirement, the end of my working life, as a business opportunity. He had used the phrase, legacy leadership clearing the way. Legacy leadership. I am 67 years old. I designed a children's hospital wing in Prince George that has been serving families for 18 years. I mentored 12 young architects who now run their own firms across this country. I have won awards I keep in a box in my garage because I find it uncomfortable to display them, and my son had been describing me to a corporate investment group in Calgary as legacy leadership clearing the way. I went back inside. The dinner was still going beautifully. My wife was laughing at something the woman beside her had said. Sylvia and Bart were at the far table with their spouses, and Sylvia caught my eye and raised her glass, and I raised mine back. My son saw me return and leaned slightly forward, watching to see if I had the document. I sat down. Everything all right? He asked. Perfectly, I said. I just needed some air. It's a big night. He nodded and looked relieved and refilled my water glass. And I sat there for the next 2 hours and finished my dinner and gave my retirement speech. I had written it myself, 12 minutes, practiced it 4 times, and I thanked everyone in the room by name, including my son, and I meant every word I said about him, and I kept the document in my blazer pocket the entire time. The next morning, I was at my lawyer's office at 8:30. Her name's Frances, and she has been practicing corporate law in Kelowna for 28 years, and she is the kind of lawyer who makes you feel calm, not because she minimizes things, but because she takes them seriously and doesn't flinch. She read the fraudulent document in about 4 minutes. She asked me 3 questions. Then she made a call. The situation, as she laid it out to me, was this. My son had presented me with a materially altered legal agreement with the intent that I would sign it, which would have constituted a valid transfer under BC corporate law, regardless of the fraudulent alteration, since the error would have been difficult to prove was not simply a printing mistake I had approved. The saving grace, the one thing that stood between him and everything he wanted, was that I had not signed it. I had folded it up and put it in my pocket instead, and now it was evidence. Frances contacted Philip. Philip provided the emails. Frances contacted a forensic accountant she trusted. Over the following 6 weeks, while my son continued to come into the office as if nothing had happened, while he continued to have Sunday dinners at our house, while he continued to send me articles about architecture he thought I'd find interesting, a habit we'd had for years, and one that I found almost unbearable to receive during those weeks. Frances and her team built a picture that was thorough enough to take to the BC Securities Commission and the Law Society. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you about my wife. She and I have been married for 39 years. She's a retired school principal. She has more good judgment in her smallest decision than most people carry in their entire lives. I told her everything the morning after the dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between us, and she listened without interrupting, which is something she does when the subject is serious. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "He's been planning this for a long time, hasn't he?" It wasn't a question. She cried once, briefly, and then she straightened up and said, "What does Francis say we should do?" That's who my wife is. The hardest part of the next 6 weeks was not the legal process. Frances was thorough and steady, and I trusted her completely. The hardest part was my son sitting across from me at Sunday dinners, passing the roasted potatoes, asking about my golf game, and me answering him, smiling at his jokes, not letting him see anything on my face. I became a better actor in those 6 weeks than I have ever been in my life. In the 5th week, Frances was ready. She had documented the altered agreement. She had the emails between my son and Meridian Capital. She had a timeline showing that the alteration had been made by my son's personal lawyer, a man named Strickland who was not, it emerged, a member of the Law Society of British Columbia, but had presented himself as one. That was a separate and serious matter. She also had something I hadn't known about. My son had, about 14 months earlier, quietly applied to change the firm's banking authority so that he could execute transactions above a certain threshold without my co-signature. The application had been flagged by the bank and never processed, but the attempt was on record. It showed a pattern. Francis filed with the BC Securities Commission on a Thursday. The following Monday, my son arrived at the firm and found that his access credentials no longer worked. Sylvia met him at the front desk. I had told Sylvia and Bart everything 2 weeks prior because they had a right to know, and because their shares were also affected by what he had tried to do, and she handed him a letter from Francis's office and said, with a kindness I thought was more than he deserved, that perhaps he should call his own lawyer. He called me instead. I let the phone ring. I was sitting in my studio at home, not the office, not my desk, but my personal studio where I still do sketches by hand, just for myself, just because I love it. And I watched the phone light up with his name, and I let it ring through to voicemail, and then I listened to the message. He said he could explain. He said it had been a misunderstanding. He said Meridian had pressured him, and he had gotten in too deep, and he had panicked, and he knew it had gone too far, but he had never meant for it to go this way. He said he was sorry. I listened to the message twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window at the lake, and I sat with it for a while. I am not going to tell you that I stopped loving my son. That would be a lie. And I refuse to lie about this, not even for the satisfaction of the ending. I love him the way you love something that is broken. Carefully, aware of where the sharp edges are, no longer sure what it's capable of holding. But love is not the same as trust, and it is not the same as justice. And I had Sylvia and Bart and my wife and 32 years of something that mattered. And I was not going to let it be taken apart by someone who had looked at me across a table at my own retirement dinner and handed me a document designed to finish me off quietly. The BC Securities Commission investigation took 4 months. During that time, Meridian Capital withdrew their interest in the firm. Whether out of self-preservation or legal advice, I don't know, and I don't care. Strickland, the fraudulent lawyer, was referred to the RCMP. My son entered a civil settlement that required him to pay restitution to the firm and removed him from any claim to the shares. He did not face criminal charges. Frances told me the evidentiary bar for criminal fraud in cases like this is high, and she was more interested in protecting the firm than in the criminal proceedings. I agreed with her. He lives in Calgary now. We don't speak. My daughter calls him occasionally. I don't ask about it. What I want to tell you, the thing I've thought about every morning since that evening in September, is this. I almost signed it. Not because I wasn't paying attention. Because I was tired and proud, and it was my retirement dinner, and I had a glass of Pinot Noir in front of me and 60 years of believing that the people who love you don't do things like this. That belief almost cost me everything. The detail that saved me was the same instinct that had saved buildings. The habit of reading what is actually in front of you, not what you expect to find. You look at the drawing. You don't assume. You verify. I went back to the firm the following spring. Not as a partner, I genuinely wanted to retire, but as a consulting architect on a single project, a small library commission in West Kelowna that Sylvia was leading. I worked 2 days a week. I had an office with a window and a drafting table and a coffee maker that I operated without asking anyone's permission. On the last day of that project, Sylvia and Bart and I walked through the finished library before the public opening. It smelled like new wood and paint, and the particular silence that new buildings have before anyone has lived in them yet. Bart said, "It's a good building." Sylvia said, "You taught us how to make good buildings." I didn't say anything for a moment because I was looking at the light coming through the north-facing windows I had specified in the original brief, landing exactly where I had calculated it would land, falling across the children's reading section in a long, warm bar of afternoon gold. "That's all I ever wanted," I said. And I meant it. I still mean it. That is all I have ever wanted, to build something that lasts. Something that serves people, something that was made with care and stands up to the light. I spent 32 years doing that work. I am not finished yet. I drove home along the lake and the water was that deep October blue that you only get in the Okanagan, and the hills had gone russet and gold, and I thought about my wife waiting at home with dinner on, and the fire going in the front room, and I thought about how lucky I am still, despite everything, to have ended up here. I turned the radio on, some old country station out of Penticton. I didn't change it. I drove home. I think about that moment a lot, the moment I set the pen down. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly, without explanation, the way you put down something that doesn't belong to you. People ask me sometimes whether I regret how it ended, whether I wish I had confronted my son at the table, or called him out in front of everyone, or done something louder, something that would have felt more like justice in the moment. And I understand the impulse. I felt it too, standing in that alley in the cold, listening to Philip's voice on the phone while the kitchen staff smoked beside the dumpster. There's a part of you that wants the scene, that wants everyone in the room to know what just happened to you. But I spent 32 years reading drawings, and what I know about drawings is that the most important information is usually quiet. It's a single dimension on a single line. You either see it or you don't. And if you react before you understand what you're looking at, you make errors that take years to undo. What saved me that night wasn't anger. It was the habit of looking carefully at what is actually in front of you, not what you expect to find. That habit didn't come from nowhere. It came from decades of discipline, from caring enough about the work to check it twice, even when you're tired, even when you trust the person who handed it to you. Integrity isn't something you perform for an audience. It's what you do when no one is watching, which in my case was precisely the bet my son had made against me. He thought I would sign because I was proud, because it was my evening and I had wine in front of me and 60 years of believing the people who love you don't do things like this. He was right that I had those things. He was right that I had those things. He was wrong that they would make me careless. The mind that protected me that night was built slowly, over a long time, by choosing to pay attention even when inattention would have been easier. That's not genius. It's just honesty applied consistently over decades, choosing to see what's real rather than what's comfortable. And that choice, made thousands of times in small moments, is what made it possible to make the right one in the large moment, when it mattered most. And then there's the question of what you do after. When the legal process is finished and the settlement is signed and your son is in Calgary and Sunday dinners are quieter than they used to be. That part doesn't resolve cleanly. I won't pretend it does, but I can tell you that I went back to the work. I sat in Sylvia's library project 2 days a week, and I drew and I thought and I watched good people building something honest. And that, showing up, continuing, refusing to let what happened hollow out what came before it, that was its own kind of answer. Frances did her job. Philip kept records when he didn't have to. Sylvia stood at the front desk and handed my son a letter with more dignity than he deserved. None of them were obligated to hold the line. They did it because they were people of character, and character is not something that announces itself. It accumulates quietly in the choices nobody sees. I drove home along the lake that October evening, and the water was that deep blue that only the Okanagan gets in autumn, and I thought, I am still here. I still know who I am. Nobody took that. That's enough. That has always been enough.